I actually just came for the food, ladies and gentlemen. I was just saying at the table that as part of my experience with the circumstance of palliative care, which is entirely personal, it always renders me somewhat embarrassed and intimidated to be in front of a group such as yourselves and to recognize the skill and the experience and the knowledge of this group. I was advised just now by a friend at the table that I should wiggle my toes in order to get rid of the excess nervous energy. So if you see me taking my shoes off, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a sign of disrespect, okay? It's just a sign of my anxieties to be asked to present to such a knowledgeable group what is a story of suffering. Not necessarily an enlightened story, but I will try to render that story as honestly as possible out of respect to the individuals involved, those individuals being my family. Okay? I'm going to start with a poem. It's called A Turning of the Tide by Maud Meehan. I used to tell my students when I taught them in high school that it wasn't important to necessarily understand the full length of a poem. It was more important to see if there were any phrases or even lines that might resonate with them. And that was their doorway into the poem. There's a couple of phrases in this poem that I think are appropriate for this gathering. It's called A Sweet, Sad Turning of the Tide by Maud Meehan. My two young sons move with assurance through the maze of ropes and sails, and they steer out of turbulence to calmer seas and drop anchor. They climb the mast, and my body tenses with past apprehensions. Suddenly one dives, and I plummet with him. I breathe again only when he emerges. As heavy mist rolls in, they guide the light craft back to harbor, and like my hands, old maps lie folded on my lap. Reaching the laddered deck, they stretch strong arms to steady me. When did this turnabout occur? I have become a passenger on their journey. And the lines that resonate for me is the line, and like my hands, old maps lie folded on my lap. For anyone who has received a life-threatening diagnosis, that resonates. The old maps don't function anymore. And the other one that resonates for me is they stretch strong arms to steady me, and I think that is an elemental dynamic of palliative care. Ladies and gentlemen, the symbol of the Canadian Medical Association is a single snake winding up and around a staff. That is the staff of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. And had I been sick during the time that he was worshipped, I would have traveled to a temple dedicated to him, and I would have spent a night there, sleeping on the floor in the company of free roaming snakes. Hence the snake around the staff with which you are all familiar. The following day, I would have recounted the dreams which had visited me as I slept, and based upon the content of those dreams, the temple priests, the doctors of the day, would have diagnosed the root of my illnesses, determined my prognosis, and prescribed the appropriate therapies. Dreams as revelations and as prognosticators were not to be dismissed or disparaged, something perhaps we have forgotten at our peril. Towards the end of the treatment for my first cancer, I dreamt that I was trapped in an underground parking garage, encased entirely in concrete, except for the back wall, which was made of glass. There was a jagged hairline crack running from floor to ceiling in that glass wall. And I understood But the only way out of the concrete tomb was to be drawn through that crack, knowing that I would be scraped down to the bone in the process. A year or so after that dream, my wife Sarah was diagnosed with Huntington's. Then came the onset and diagnosis of my second cancer. My wife, though symptomatic, curiously symptomatic, we didn't know the history of her family, her mother was a war bride, refused to seek any medical attention to herself until it was thought that I was better. And immediately upon her diagnosis, I became ill again. And that second cancer was followed in successive years by the Huntington's diagnosis of 3 of our 4 children. And more recently, by the deeply unsettling diagnosis of an incurable, life-threatening illness that has been given our 3-year-old grandchild. And though there are a lot of younger faces in this audience, there are people who might very well be grandparents themselves. And I think they might understand how heartrending it is to see your grandchild sick like that. The scraping raw down to the bone provoked by the illnesses afflicting our family has been relentless. It has staggered and exhausted us emotionally and physically, economically and socially. The heavy mist rolls in, and old maps lie folded on our laps. After 16 years of consecutive family traumas, I find myself today more often than not profoundly distraught, weary, and disoriented. I feel like I am lost upon uncharted waters and alone and frightened. And to be bluntly honest, I am afraid that I will fail to properly care for my wife, for our kids and our grandchildren. I am afraid that I will simply not have the resilience and the courage needed to do so. The English poet John Donne, who knew something of being sick and famous for the lines about no man being an island unto himself, died of stomach cancer, so they believe at this point, wrote, "As sickness is the greatest misery, so the greatest misery of sickness is solitude. Even the physician dares scarce come." My wife is dying in slow motion, ladies and gentlemen. Each new physical or cognitive loss provokes another period of mourning for our family. As is often the case, the concentric circles of care formed in the days following her diagnosis have slowly dissipated over the length of her protracted and complex illness. Something to be understood about what is happening in modern medicine, where we are living longer with more complex illnesses, which places a burden on both friends and family in terms of their endurance. It is often the case in such circumstances, and it's entirely understandable. Life moves on and away from you as it must. It moves on and away from you. People grow weary from your heaviness. A debilitating loneliness and sense of isolation fills the void left in the wake of their departures. Each evening when I kiss Sarah goodnight, she fixes her eyes firmly, beseechingly on mine, as if to anchor me there in the room with her. She is afraid. Ladies and gentlemen, she is confused. She is angry. But most of all, she is alone. She turns her back on me as I leave. I drive home in the company of her loneliness and grief. They have become my constant companions. They sap my energy, and they trouble my sleep, and they exhaust my spirit. In the darkness of our separation, Sarah and I exist in solitudes of grief. Our children are scattered far and wide across Canada. In all likelihood, the communal resources provided by our extended Nova Scotia family will not be there to support them throughout their own struggles. From afar, they watch the progress of their mother's illness, and they see themselves mirrored in her suffering. They worry about the burden of care that I, their father, have assumed. They worry about the burden of care they assume their own families will have to endure. They speak of recent legislation, and they wonder if it would apply to them or provide a way for them to care as a final act for their family. Sarah did not see the darkness that was lurching towards her. They do, and they will not have it so. I am undone, as I think any parent in this room can understand. I am undone when I hear them speak that way, ladies and gentlemen. Undone that at such an early age they should be dwelling on such things. And so I come to you today as a patient and as a caregiver, as a husband, as a father, and as a grandfather. I come to you from the context, the crucible of the illnesses that seem to be stalking our family. I come seeking a community dedicated to the compassionate care of the critically ill and the consolation of those who love them. On a personal level, I come seeking those who would care for my family, both near and far, should I succumb to the cancer still sleeping slyly within my veins, or fall apart from the weight of my grief and anxieties. I come in support of your efforts to advance the practice of quality palliative care throughout our country for the benefit of my family, because it's a personal matter, but also for the benefit of countless other families within this country of ours. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk, a gentleman I considered a companion in my youth as I read his writings, and he says, "You gradually struggle less and less for an ideal and more for specific people." I think that's a lovely line. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships which saves everything. Should be inscribed at the top of every palliative care booklet. Joan Halifax, a Buddhist teacher and a servant of the sick and dying, suggests that the practice of palliative care requires a strong back and a soft front. Fundamental characteristics of good palliative care. A strong back and a soft front. The strong back being the technical competencies, the skills and knowledge crucial to minimizing the suffering and maximizing the quality of life of those living through a life-ending illness. And the soft front, ladies and gentlemen, being the authentic, resonant heart of the caregiver. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships which saves everything. When the efficacy of curative medical interventions has run its course, as it eventually will for everyone in this room, quality medical care becomes not so much a matter of what you do to the patient as a matter of who you are willing to be with that person. Such profoundly vulnerable and personal relationships, I believe, are not only acts of transformative healing compassion, but acts of courage as well. The courage to abandon the security and protection of familiar roles and routines, the clinical postures and personas we adopt to effect an insulating distance, a courage to ultimately surrender the struggle to intervene, to make life conform to our own wishes, and let the current of the illness carry us where it will. And the courage to abide. There are certain words that I think we've been impoverished because they've drifted away from us, and abide is one of those. The courage to abide attentively in the kinship of silence, the kinship of silence, when words are too weak or intrusive or disruptive to be spoken. The hardest thing is to remain in that kinship of silence. We want to do something or say something rather than remain in the intensity of those moments. But it's at that very time that we cannot abandon the suffering. This state of vulnerable kinship is the still point in the turning world of palliative care. It is the lived acknowledgement and therapeutic significance of an authentic, personal, compassionate relationship between the caregiver and the patient, a relationship of trust, commitment, and tenderness. Another word we've lost somehow or other in our medical lexicon, tenderness. It is a gift, a blessing given, and not without cost, by the caregiver to the patient. The gift of community, the gift of consolation, meaning, and companionship. A gift which ennobles the caregiver and the patient in equal measure. I'm going to repeat that line because I think it's important, because I get so sick and tired of people talking about the professions in terms that deny the possibility that it might very well be an act of nobility to dedicate your life to caring for people. My wife is not a health care consumer. She is a person. She has a name. She's not just a pathology. And people who care for her genuinely, in my estimation, are noble. It is a gift which ennobles the caregiver as well as the patient in equal measure, a gift given until we are no more. It is the ancient archetypal expression of human solidarity, that one should care for another. And it is the measure of what is best in us. What is best in us as people and as a country. Ladies and gentlemen, there are mornings when I can no longer find my feet, when standing is a struggle against the gravity of grief. The compass needle cannot find true north, and the world becomes a vortex of despair. The suffering of the critically ill permeates the body and the soul of the dying, and it permeates the body and the soul of their family members as well. Dying is a family affair. We need the skills and the knowledge, the wisdom and the counsel, the compassionate companionship, the strong arms, going back to that poem, the strong arms reaching out to steady us, of enlightened caregivers as we die and as we mourn the dying of our loved ones. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that the vast majority of Canadians support the provision of quality palliative care within our public health care system. We also know that current access to such care is far from universal for Canadians. We know that as our country grows older, more and more people will find themselves in circumstances similar to my own. In words lifted from the brochure of this conference, we need a national strategy so that everyone can access timely, quality care in the last phase of their life. We need the articulate and persuasive advocacy of individuals and groups such as those gathered here this morning. The articulate and persuasive advocacy. In the pragmatically succinct words of Dr. Harvey Chochinov, in the end-of-life care, we do not have a vocal constituency. The dead are no longer here to speak, the dying often cannot speak, and the bereaved are often too overcome by their loss to speak. This conference, which begins today, is singularly important. May you speak with a united and passionate voice on behalf of my family and the families of all Canadians, on behalf in particular, underscored, on behalf in particular of all those who cannot speak for themselves, the disenfranchised, the poor, the victims of injustice or indifference or intolerance. Ladies and gentlemen, when asked to identify the root cause of suffering she witnessed on a daily basis, Mother Teresa of Calcutta replied that the problem of the world is that we draw the circle of our family too small. We draw the circle of our family too small. We must draw it large and larger again. I believe, as mentioned earlier, that the extension of compassionate kinship to one and all of which she speaks is the very heart of palliative care. I believe it is also the very heart of a civil society. A civil society. That we care for each other. And we translate that care into legislation and a commitment of the resources necessary to provide that care effectively. I believe it is also the very heart of civil society and the founding principle of our public health care system. In the midst of such a divisive and troubling world, and we know that. We know the significance of the circumstances in many countries, including particularly of late in the United States. In the midst of such a divisive and troubling world where exclusivity threatens to become the morally corrosive mantra of the day. Me, not us. Us, not them. Let us continue the struggle to create and model civility as an act of courage and vision and compassion. Let us honor the critically ill and the dying with the best medical care possible. Let us extend and enhance that care from sea to sea to sea, and as a nation, as a people. Let us draw the circle of our families large and larger and larger again. Thank you.